transcendability of boundaries is returned, is affirmed in this experience. Well, yet here we are having this on the brink of a planetary meltdown of culture and ecosystem. So is this just some kind of dancing on the brink? Is this kind of ultimate self-indulgence? Does it feed back into the central moral problem of the age, which is what is to be done? What are we to do? How can we be effective, whatever that means? Is there a discernible role for each of us to play in the metamorphosis and near death of the planet that we are now experiencing? Or are we simply to witness it? Well, I don't think there's any point in thinking about these kinds of questions unless you draw back to the big picture, to first premises. A good example of what I mean is, suppose we save the rainforests and stabilize the population and so forth and so on, and then 50 years down the line, the sun explodes. It means we didn't get it. We were not reading correctly the message nature was trying to hand to us. And so we did the wrong thing and was going to be blown out of the water for such churlishness. So what's important is to figure out what is going on before you start pushing in the process. And I don't think you can do it from within a culture. In other words, if you're a person of decent intent and moderate intelligence, and you read the great minds of your culture and study their thought, it's insufficient because everybody is bound within an illusion of language. The entire enterprise of culture is this illusion of language. Homer was as sick with it as Heidegger. So there's no going back or getting, no classic reception. What we have to do is reach past to some kind of experience. It must be anchored in an experience. But there is this thing about being human, which we as a culture have ignored, repressed, don't want to talk about, face, or think about, which is you can get loaded. And nobody knows quite what to make of this. We dance around it with the same kind of furious, ambiguous intensity that we also reserve for sex, which is also a boundary dissolving, momentary loss of self into some kind of greater whole. And it also just drives us into a frenzy. We establish boundaries, we have hierarchies, we push it this way and that. It just drives us up the wall. Whoever she was who designed this system had the good sense to connect this whole sexual impulse very tightly into the generative process, so that there's no way you can get sex out of the human experience. People have tried in all times and places in many strange ways. 150 years ago, they were putting pants on pianos because it was thought that young men should not see pianos unclothed because it might excite them to impure thoughts. This is real. In England, in our culture, not New Guinea or the moon, but in England, pianos wore pants. But the psychedelic option is sort of like an appendix. You can have it, but you don't need it, apparently. Apparently. That's the key thing. In other words, whether or not you have the psychedelic experience does not stand between you and the ability to pass on your genes into time. It does not stand between you and continued existence, like the autonomic reflex of breathing. It's a kind of potential loop in development, which we can, as culturally coordinated creatures, choose to follow or choose not to follow. But this development is very recent. Until, pick a number, 10,000 years ago, the onset of puberty, which was, a wave of hormonal release, basically. The onset of puberty was the signal to the social mechanisms of the people to begin the administration of psychedelic plants, to carry people into adulthood, to carry them into a relationship with the mythological experience so that they now, has realized adults who are mature culture or whatever they are. We, in our anxiety about all this, and I'll talk about why I'm sure it will come out, but present just to say we have experienced this, and we have enforced upon ourselves the infantile. Now, this is a phenomenon that's called neoteny. Neoteny is the preservation of adult characteristics into adulthood, childhood characteristics, or infantile characteristics, or even fetal characteristics. So, for instance, all primate features are heritable, but only the human female fetal characteristics throughout life. The very large head of the human infant, the percentage relationship to body mass remains very much in the fetal end of the statistics throughout life. The very prolonged period in which cultural skills are acquired, up to 16 years. Well, this tendency for biological neoteny, which was reinforced by mutagenic influences in the diet, is carried over into culture as a cultural characteristic. And as you know, that every generation views the generation on as more childish than itself. And we look back to our rugged grandparents who slogged across the plains, and I suppose they look back to people in chainmail who were only 4 feet high, who, could go without eating for 6 months or something. And it just, we have become more and more soft, more and more infantile. And the final phase of this is just the decision that we never needed to grow up at all. We never needed to find out about the nature of our relationship to being at all. And so the psychedelics were suppressed. And what we have in pre-adolescent child is an extreme expression of ego. This is, the 11-year-old child, let's take as the example, is the supreme ego. And in a sense, we got hung up at that place because we didn't get hung up in it. We fell into it. We were in balance, but the suppression of psychedelics created the precondition that allowed the generation of ego. And it's very complicated. One of the factors of what works, you see, the Russian style, the shamanic style of the nomadic hunter-gatherer is a style of goddess worship and psychedelic shamanism and orgiastic religion. And shamanism and the religion overlap each other considerably. The style that replaced that was a style of dominant hierarchy, with powerful males controlling females at the center of these hierarchies. And to my mind, the concern that caused the shift was the accumulation in the psyche of enough ego that return for the line of male paternity. In other words, man wanted to know who their children were. And that made the organic style of religion in conflict, because that was all about, the children were the children of the group, and sex was a shared activity, even though there might be bonding. But once people got once men got it into their heads that they wanted to know who their offspring were, then females had to be controlled very rigidly, and there had to be control of sexual. And the whole thing just turned into a nightmare. My women, my property, my children, my food, my territory, and so on and so forth. So you see, what had been going on before was a true symbiosis. And this is the new idea that I want to communicate, and that I'm absolutely serious about, and too literal, that our glory and our uniqueness and why we are as we are is because we are a plant, animal, symbiotic species. Our ordinary state, our state of nature, the way in which we existed until 10,000 years ago, was in a very tightly bound symbiotic relationship with plants. We domesticated them, and we spread them, and we created environments for them through the use of birth. And in return to this mysterious connection opened up, where real information, couched in humanly cognizable terms, information on where the reindeer went, who you should marry, what the weather's going to do, stuff like that. Real information traces back and forth. Now, biologists are familiar with the notion of pheromone, message-bearing chemicals that regulate behavior within a species. But we're just getting ready to go to the next level and recognize the possibility of what have been called exopheromones. Pheromones that regulate behavior between species. And it's very clear that, in climax ecosystems of great age, such as the equatorial tropics of this planet, exopheromonal interactions become the major mediating force in all the things going on. The old notion of competition and survival is now completely bankrupt. The way nature works is the species to make itself the most necessary to other species. The one that can cut energy with the most of its neighbors, so that it's a successful one, but it maximizes cooperation, maximize integration. This is an example of evolutionary strategy. I mean, of course, you can be a jaguar and crash around in the forest, then you can be a little smaller than you. But jaguar is a memory in the fossil record of the science driven and not part of distinction. So, the dynamic of life dictates that these energy levels be held very close.
They use me as a distraction.
Well, no, I think, nothing is outside of the natural, but all of this can be explained in terms of climatological flux on the African continent. Very briefly, the primates evolved in Africa. Out of the primates came the hominids, which were these glacial, upright, opposable thumb binocular vision, and there were a number of these, and they existed for, over the past 6 million years. But Africa and the planet, because of repeated glaciation, is subject to cycles of drying. And every time the ice moved south, primate populations were bottled up in Africa. And we know there have been 4 glaciations. Immediately the last one, the ice melted 20,000 years ago. And out of Africa, that last time, came pastoralists, people who had domesticated cattle and had a style of following cattle around rather than being just strictly hunter-gatherers. Well, I maintain what happened was these arboreal, tree canopy living apes came under pressure as the continent dried up to expand their diet because the forests were disappearing and being replaced by grassland. Well, most animal species eat only 1 or 2 kinds of food. This is a general rule in nature, and it's in order to hold down exposure to mutagenic influence. But when an animal population is in a situation of food scarcity, the logical thing to do is to begin to test food sources and to expand your repertoire of food. Well, that's what these primates coming out of the trees did. Number one, they began eating meat, which gave them a real interest that they had never had before in these ungulate mammals that were evolving in the grasslands. And they began to test all kinds of other foods in the environment. Well, when you do that, you are exposing your population to mutation. And mutation rates soar. And it was during this period that the human brain size doubled in like 1.5 million years. Someone said it was the most rapid evolutionary expansion of a major organ ever seen in fossil records. Nothing like it ever happened. Why? What was making this happen? Well, it looks like probably huge numbers of mutations were taking place in this population because people were literally eating anything they could get their hands on. And in this environment of the grasslands, the mushrooms were growing on the dung of these ungulate animals. Well, now a weird thing about psilocybin is that in very low doses so low that you don't feel anything, your vision, they've done tests with this, and there is an improvement in visual acuity on psilocybin at low doses. Well, you can imagine the evolutionary impact of something like this on a hunting-gathering population where visual acuity is all the difference between you and grim starvation. It means a population of animals, a population of these evolving hominids that accept the mushroom into their diet, have just been given a tremendous leg up on nearby competing troops, the competing troops that don't have it. It's like chemical binoculars. So immediately then there is a reason, an evolutionary reason for mushrooms to be eaten and for the spread, for mushrooms to be accepted into the diet as an item and so forth and so on. Well, so then you take slightly more mushrooms, and like all alkaloids and it's a CNS arousal. It means you feel alert, you feel interested, you want to boogie, and also if you're male, you can sustain an erection. So arousal means arousal. So then this stuff is an enzyme promoting sexual activity at that level. Well, sexual activity, the number of copulations that occur within a population is directly related to the number of successful impregnations. So suddenly you have these horny primates, be a lot of more interest in sexual contact and partners and all this. This means that these psilocybin-using creatures that are now more successful at hunting and more interested in sex have all kinds of sexual hormones that force them to outbreed the dull, uninteresting folks who don't eat mushrooms at this point. Well, so then how do you get this? And it's no longer about sexual activity or clarity of vision. It becomes about the psychedelic trip, this tremendum, which is as awesome to you and me as it was to these so-called primitive folks 20,000 years ago. We don't know what to make of it. They didn't know what to make of it. They founded a religion about it. We're trying to start the engine of the same religion all over again. And the way in which this religious ecstasis manifests itself is in language activity, in cognition, but in glossolalia, in spontaneous outbursts of syntactically organized vocal activity. While the great mystery of human emergence, of course, is language. What is it? Where did it come from? How did it ever get going on such a scale? So forth and so on. But it looks to me like what we're seeing in psilocybin is a kind of neurological enzyme, a catalyst in the environment that could take an evolving primate population and put it through a series of forced changes that produce ultimately a self-reflected, minded creature practicing a shamanic mother goddess religion in this nomadic context. And that was paradise, and that was the ideal for the archaic revival. In other words, that Eden actually existed, that we are made for better things than what we've got. You know, it says in Finnegans Wake, here in Moycane was the red light district of Dublin. Here in Moycane we flop on the seamy side, but up in the Yent, prospector, you sprout all your worth and woof your wings. That's a promise for the future. Up in the Yent, you sprout all your worth and woof your wings. But also, antes, we sprouted our worth and woofed our wings. And this whole nostalgia for a perfected shamanism in prehistory is reasonable, I think. I mean, I think we had something, an unimaginably precious gift. We had consciousness and dynamic order. Consciousness as we experience it now within the confines of history is most analogous to cancer. I mean, it's just, replicating, spreading. But it once was a dynamic, ordered thing. People lived, they died, they made love, they had children, they herded their flocks, they had ecstatic flights into dimensions which we cannot even conceive of, and they felt no need, to break into the earth, to divert the rivers, to do all of this stuff. And even if we're not aesthetically attracted to that, we have to make a value judgment on it because it was not a runaway process. It did not push everything toward crisis. Okay, well then, so what happened? What the hell happened if that's how it was? Well, nature is just an ongoing story. The very drying processes that created those grasslands, that created those pressures on diet, that created that mother goddess religion, that evolved that process, and the grasslands dried up, and the winds began to blow, and the water holes got further and further apart from each other, and the mushroom festivals went from every Saturday night to the first Saturday of every month, and then to the once a year, and then to once a year, and then to once every 5 years, and then to never. And in the absence of psychedelics, this thing gets going. Literally like a calcareous growth in the bloodstream of the body. If you don't inoculate yourself against it, you begin to take it and grow, and the world, the boundaries of the world begin to move inward, and you no longer see things on a planetary scale or a millennial scale, or my children, all. And at that point, you get the appearance of kingship, the age of Gilgamesh. I mean, my God, when you read the story of Gilgamesh, you just wonder what's going on. Gilgamesh spurned the goddess and the goddess sent a bull, which to me is, symbolic of the mystery of the mushroom, the ungulate herding horned animal, the crypto symbol for the goddess sends a bull, and he rejects the bull. He rejects the goddess. He rejects the bull. Then he takes Enkidu, the shaman figure, and forces him to go with him into the wilderness. And what do they do in the wilderness? This oldest of all myths, this story of the first tree of life.
All right.
That's what they do. They cut down the tree of life, and then it goes forward. The earliest